Running beside Chiori is Fontaine's best seamstress being Chiori. Touted as the better Albedo, her damage potential surpasses him if you play her in the right teams. Of course, in the current times, the question begs, is she worth pulling for given the current state of the meta? The short and long answer is no, but that is very conditional and that's not entirely her fault. So, quick disclaimer, if you really do like her character and you enjoy playing her, don't let anyone stop you, including myself, from pulling her. I mean, I only got her from my account because I was simply bewitched by her smile in her burst animation, and I don't know what this says about me, but I'm sure some people out there can relate. Anyways, being the better Albedo, her kit is a complete upgrade over his for a few reasons. Albedo is a split scaler where his blossom damage scales of defense while his flower summoning and burst damage scales of attack, which is why we have the abomination of a 5-star limited weapon also known as the Summit Shaper. On the other hand, Chiori is a dual scaler where both her skill and burst scale of attack and defense, which means any attack percent rolls on your artifacts is still quite usable on her. Also, her doll, Tomato, is not considered a construct. That means her damage will be more consistent than Albedo since constructs in general does have a hidden HP and can get destroyed by enemy attacks. Now, why do I say that she might be a unit not worth pulling for? I would say most of the blame lies in her element being Geo and the lack of its identity. So usually, most of the elements in the game are remembered for the reactions that they have which defines their identity. Like, Pyro is known for being the amplifying element with reactions like Vaporize and Melt. Cryo is mostly known for Freeze, which can prevent enemies from moving. Electro and Dendro work synergistically with reactions like Quicken and Hyper Bloom. Anemo is seen as the crowd controlling element with characters like Kazuha or Venti and even Jin to a certain extent, and also the debuffing element with artifacts like the VV set. While Hydro could be seen as the enabler for most of these strong reactions, with its units being HP scalers that are either great healers or strong DPS units overall. Meanwhile, for Geo, Hoyo doesn't seem to know what to do with it. Initially, I was under the impression that Geo is an inert element that doesn't want to rely on reactions and that the units get stronger when paired with other Geo units. This was shortly after Ito and Gorok was released. But then with the release of characters like Navia, Yunjin, and Albedo, it made me think otherwise. So Navia wants Crystallize in order to fuel the damage for elemental skill, so you can't exactly run mono Geo for her. Yunjin has a passive that prefers being run in a rainbow team where it buffs the defense, while Albedo has a passive that buffs the team's elemental mastery after casting his burst. This is even more apparent with the release of our latest Geo unit being Kachina, a unit with an indestructible Geo construct that can use the new Natlan support set, which doesn't exactly work if you run her in mono Geo teams. So as time goes on, I'm starting to wonder if Geo units even identify as Geo units at all. While we are going to be getting Shilonen in the next patch and she's going to be a very interesting unit, I don't feel like she will be able to save Geo as an element, but rather she will save Geo units from themselves. While Chiori does have access to very FTP-friendly weapons such as the Harbinger of Dawn, a 3-star weapon, Cinnabar Sprindle, the Albedo event weapon from way back then, also with her artifacts having access to the likes of Golden Troop and the House of Opulent Dreams, it is unfortunate to see her potential tied down by her own element. Things are even more grim when you consider how unreliable Geo constructs can get. Not only do these constructs get in your way in the middle of combat, they also have a hidden HP bar, which means that they can get destroyed after receiving enough damage. Kachina's drill is the only exception, however. So rather than fixing or buffing Geo constructs as a whole, it is clear that Hoyo would rather sell the solution rather than fix the problem at its core. And it doesn't make things better with the fact that her C1 solely exists to sell you the solution of not needing to run a construct unit for Chiori, but you still need to run a Geo unit with her at least. So all that aside, if you still want to pull for her, let's take a look at her constellations. So C1 is the limiter removal constellation as it removes her need for a construct to summon the second doll. It also permanently enables her Geo damage passive and increase the attack range of the dolls overall. The only condition is that you just simply need another Geo unit in the team and it does not necessarily have to be a construct. This constellation is about a 59% damage increase compared to a scenario with only one doll. C2 adds a third doll after using her burst, which is roughly about a 33% damage increase. C3 adds 3 levels to a skill, leading to a modest 16% damage increase from the previous constellation. C4 summons the same dolls from C2 but just a separate set after triggering out the follow-up effect from her skill, and this leads to an overall 23% damage increase from her previous constellation. C5 adds 3 levels to her burst, which is rather minor given how little she will use it. And lastly, C6 turns her into a DPS monster, as triggering the follow-up effect from her skill will not only reduce her skill cooldown by 12 seconds, it also mega buffs her normal attack by giving it defense scaling, and if you play her in the right style, it is possible for you to have basically a very high uptime on both her dolls and her Geo infusion. This constellation is about a 22% damage increase from C5, making C6 into an overall 135% damage increase to C0. Now for teams. So before we go to the next section, here are the different abbreviations that I will be using in the next section, so feel free to pause the video just to take a look. Since simulating Geo teams is a little tricky with Chiori, especially how quick swappy it tends to get, all the teams that you're about to see are based on the sims done by other users, so keep in mind that every sim has their own setup and it may not necessarily be relatable to everyone. My only purpose of doing this is to show you guys what kind of teams can actually work for her and what kind of performance you can expect out of it. So given how Chiori works, her teammates of interest would be the likes of any construct units like Ningguang, Ito, Navia to a certain extent, and Albedo. So for the first team, we just have the regular config with Ningguang Goro, and as you can see, the team's damage result is very much expected of a high-end Geo team, resulting to roughly a 53.9k DPS over 90-second duration. In terms of damage contribution, Ningguang is mostly the one doing most of the damage, but since all of Goro's buffs actually buff everyone in the team and it's not tied to the active character, Chiori can benefit greatly from it, with her contributing quite a good amount of damage to the overall team. This is a very simple and straightforward team, albeit you do require C6 Goro, and the performance is definitely decent, assuming that you're not going against an enemy that requires any sort of elemental shield breaking. Now, an interesting team that I also found on the Teams DB over on the GC Sim site is the same team, but essentially you replace Goro with Emily. As everyone knows, Emily is a pretty strong off-field Dendro DPS, and the rotation for this specific team is a bit interesting, but to summarize it, essentially you just kind of like use Ningguang's skill and burst whenever available, and when the burning aura is gone, you simply reset it by swapping to Bennett, triggering again so that you can maintain your Emily's damage. In terms of the overall DPS distribution, Ningguang is doing the most, with Chiori's value falling off a bit less, but the overall team DPS is quite high because Emily is doing roughly about a third of the entire team's damage. So this is actually quite an interesting team, and I would like to record the footage and try this out on my own, though it's going to be a bit scuffed because the current Abyss is quite buffed to a specific amount, especially for any elemental skill users. So for her next team is going to be Ito. So Ito's best team does consist of Chiori to a certain extent, simply because she is a better version of Albedo. On top of that, Ushi is considered a Geo construct, so as long as Ushi is out there whenever Chiori summons her doll, that means you can always maintain the 2 doll uptime pretty high. And this specific configuration uses Furina with a lack of a proper healing with Goro on the side, resulting to an overall DPS of 55k. In terms of the damage distribution, Ito is obviously the one going to be doing the most damage, but Chiori is, I guess you could say, somewhat far behind, but she is carrying her own weight in this team. It would be interesting to see how the dynamic of this team would change with the release of Shilonen in the next patch. Also, Ito read on when. And of course, if we consider the other team or her supposed partner, is the Navia Double Pyro team. Although the downside of this team is that Navia does not really summon any sort of construct in order for your Chiori to take advantage of it, but the overall team DPS is quite decent, with Navia carrying most of her weight, roughly resulting to a 57k overall DPS over an 83-second sim time. The overall rotation is pretty straightforward, and the fact that Chiori's doll is not considered a Geo construct means you're able to have a very consistent off-field Geo application. On top of that, the energy generation is quite nice for Navia, especially because you don't have to rely on something that can't move, such as Zhongli Pillar or Albedo Flower. Of course, you can argue that Kachina is definitely going to be a better spot here for the overall damage buff, but I would say it's quite similar, and I can't really test the Kachina team simply because we don't really have Kachina in the sim yet, but maybe I'll look into that in the future. And of course, for the final team, we have the double construct team, where the same situation with Yelan and Xingqiu, where instead of comparing them both, we run them both together. This results to a very modest amount of 51k DPS, which is actually quite notable when you consider the Ito Furina team has like 55k even when Ito is on the battle pass weapon with Furina. So Chiori being paired with Albedo is definitely an interesting amount. Now Chiori is definitely going to be carrying most of her weight, with most of the team's damage basically coming from her, but Albedo does contribute by a decent amount. This kind of seems like a construct no brain kind of thing, where you basically just sit there and basically do nothing, because I'm pretty sure Albedo's flower blossom damage only triggers whenever you hit an enemy, and the dolls are going to automatically hit any enemies in range, so very likely you probably can just stand there and basically do nothing. To sum things up, Chiori has her own niche, which is very much locked behind the requirement of having a Geo construct on field. Her best teams would at least include another Geo unit to enable her damage, which is something worth considering given our current lineup of Geo units and the fact that constructs are absolutely terrible at trying to exist. I would say her value right now is very much tied to what Geo characters you have in your account, and any further changes would require more time depending on when and what kind of Geo units Hoyo intend to release in the near future. And speaking of Geo units, Shilonen is going to be released next patch, and I would dare say that she will very much shake the meta by quite a bit, especially for Geo units overall. So what do you guys think of Chiori? Are you guys going to poll for her, or is this an easy skip for you? Regardless, share your thoughts in the comments down below, and otherwise, this is Ethereal signing off. Peace.